If our waitress is finished studying my $500 million deal, Alexander Royce said, loud enough for every investor in the private dining room to hear, perhaps she can tell us how to spend $500 million. Naomi Brooks stood beside the long glass table on the 58th floor of Halcyon Tower, holding a silver water pitcher with both hands. She wore the black uniform of the Meridian Room, her hair tied back neatly, and shoes so worn at the heel that each step had begun to whisper against the marble floor. Under the cuff of her sleeve was a faded hospital wristband from the morning visit with her mother. In her apron pocket was a cracked phone screen showing 3 missed calls from Mercy South Medical Center. The men at the table laughed. No one asked why her hand had stopped above the water glass. No one asked why her eyes had moved to the small line at the bottom of the acquisition summary. They saw a waitress. They saw a black woman with a tray. They saw someone paid to disappear. Alexander leaned back in his chair, smiling the way powerful men smile when they have already decided the room belongs to them. Come on, Miss Waterpitcher, if you're smart enough to frown at my numbers, say it. What should I do with $500 million? More laughter. Martin Vale, Alexander's lead advisor, smiled without showing his teeth. Elena Hart, the restaurant director, froze near the wine cabinet, afraid of losing the most profitable table of the year. Julian Price, the oldest investor at the table, did not laugh. Naomi placed the pitcher down slowly. Within 48 hours, the man laughing at her would order a full legal audit, fire the advisor sitting beside him, and stand before his own board, trying to explain why a waitress had seen the risk his million-dollar team had buried. But in that moment, Naomi only looked at the document on the table and said one sentence. I would not put the money into this deal. The laughter stopped. Not slowly, at once. The private dining room of the Meridian Room had been built for people who wanted power with a skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked over Manhattan, where office towers glittered like money had become architecture. The carpet was charcoal gray. The walls were paneled in dark walnut. The air smelled of black truffle, expensive cologne, and the sharp ink of freshly printed contracts. At the center table sat Alexander Royce, 54 years old, founder of Royce Capital, a man whose name appeared on business magazines, hospital donor walls, and court filings with equal confidence. He wore a navy suit made in London, a watch worth more than Naomi's annual salary, and the relaxed cruelty of someone who had never been forced to explain himself to anyone holding a tray. In front of him lay the Silver Haven Care acquisition package. $500 million. 22 senior care facilities, 8 states, 300 pages of projections. One signature expected before midnight. Martin Vale had been presenting for 40 minutes. He moved through the slide deck on a black laptop, showing land values, occupancy charts, debt ratios, and projected conversion gains. Every line seemed to say the same thing. Low risk, high return, move fast. Alexander liked deals that sounded like victory before the lawyers finished reading. Martin knew that. Silver Haven is exactly the kind of distressed asset portfolio we built this firm to seize, Martin said. Underused real estate, bloated staffing, soft management, sentimental operators. We buy, we restructure, we extract value. A young investor named Brent Mallory raised his glass. To extraction. Several men laughed. Naomi refilled water at the corner of the table. She kept her face still. That was a skill. In 3 years at the Meridian Room, she had heard men describe layoffs as discipline, rent hikes as market correction, and nursing staff cuts as operational efficiency. She had learned that rich people could say harm in polished words and still expect dessert. She moved behind Martin's chair and reached for the next glass. That was when she saw the line, not the headline number, not the chart. A footnote at the bottom of page 87, lease adjustment triggered upon material change of use. Naomi's hand paused for less than 1 second. But Alexander saw it. He noticed small reactions because he enjoyed deciding what they meant. He tapped the table. Did something trouble you? Naomi looked up. No, sir. No. Alexander's smile widened. He turned to the table. Gentlemen, she says no, but I saw a look. You all saw the look. A few investors chuckled. Naomi lowered the pitcher. I was only making sure I did not spill. Martin looked at her uniform name tag. Naomi, is it? Yes, sir. Martin's tone was smooth, but his eyes were not. Then, perhaps make sure, quietly. Alexander lifted one hand. No, Martin, let us not discourage intellectual curiosity. The table laughed again. Naomi felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she did not blink. She had been taught by her mother that humiliation works by making you rush. If you rush, you give cruel people more to use. So Naomi breathed once, slow, quiet. Alexander pointed at the acquisition book. Maybe she has discovered something our lawyers, analysts, lenders, and advisors all missed. That would be a remarkable evening. Brent Mallory laughed. Maybe she shorted the nursing home market between appetizers. Elena Hart stepped forward quickly. Mr. Royce, I'm so sorry. Naomi, please return to service station. Naomi reached for the pitcher. Alexander raised a finger. Stay. Elena went still. Naomi felt the room shift. It was no longer about water. It was about ownership. Alexander looked at Elena. Your employee seems interested in the transaction. I'm a generous man. Let us educate her. Elena forced a smile. Of course, sir, but she is working. And I'm paying for the room, Alexander said. The sentence landed with quiet violence. Elena looked down. Naomi saw it. The moment a person in authority decides keeping a client comfortable matters more than protecting a worker. That was the first betrayal of the night. Naomi did not blame Elena completely. The restaurant survived on men like Alexander Royce. Private rooms, investor dinners, bottles of wine priced like rent. One complaint from the wrong billionaire could cost staff hours, tips, and jobs. Still, silence has a sound. Naomi heard it. Alexander leaned back, enjoying himself now. Tell us, Naomi, if someone placed $500 million in your hands, what would you do? Brent said, I know what I would do. Buy better shoes. A few men looked down at Naomi's feet. Her shoes were polished, but the left heel had a thin crack near the seam. She had noticed it that morning while helping her mother into a clinic chair. She had told herself the shoes could last another month. Now the whole table saw them. Naomi's face did not change. Julian Price set down his fork. That is enough, Brent. Brent looked surprised. Alexander ignored Julian. He lifted his wine glass. Answer the question, $500 million. What does a waitress recommend? Naomi looked at the acquisition summary, then at Martin, then at Alexander. She could apologize and leave. She could swallow the insult and keep the job. She could pretend she had not seen the line. Her mother's voice came back from that morning, soft but tired, at their small kitchen table in Queens. Naomi, money is not evil, but greed teaches people to forget who paid the bill. Naomi had been cutting a blood pressure pill in half because the refill had not been approved yet. She had looked at Clara Brooks' hands, swollen from years of accounting work and illness, and she had promised herself she would make it through one more double shift. Now, the same kind of deal that had broken her mother's health sat open under the chandelier. Naomi placed the water pitcher on the table. I would start by asking why the seller is rushing. No one laughed this time. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Go on. Naomi felt Elena's eyes on her. A warning, a plea, maybe both. Naomi continued anyway. Silver Haven. CARE has 22 facilities, but this forecast treats them as if they behave like one clean portfolio. They do not. At least 4 facilities are in counties with declining senior population and shrinking local reimbursement support. If occupancy drops 5% in those locations, the projected cash flow does not cover the debt service the way this model says it will. Martin's smile faded. You read that from pouring water. Naomi looked at him. I read it from your table. Brent scoffed. That is public information. Then it should have been in the main deck, Naomi said. The room tightened. Alexander stopped smiling completely. Martin leaned forward. Miss Brooks, complex portfolios are not judged by one simplified observation. No, Naomi said. They are judged by the assumptions people hide. Julian Price turned slightly toward her. What else? Martin shot him a look. Julian ignored it. Naomi swallowed. The second problem is legal exposure. The model treats pending resident complaints as ordinary operating noise. But Silver Haven has clusters of unresolved care complaints in 3 states. If Royce Capital buys the chain and announces partial conversion into luxury apartments, families and regulators will connect those complaints to the conversion plan. That becomes more than a cost line. It becomes a public story. Alexander's eyes narrowed. What public story? Naomi held his gaze. That rich investors pushed elderly residents out of care beds to build apartments with skyline balconies. No one moved. Outside the window, a helicopter crossed the night between towers. Inside, Martin's hands flattened on the table. That is an emotional interpretation. Naomi shook her head. No, it is reputational risk. You may not care about the moral language, but markets care when headlines change lender confidence. Julian Price leaned back. She is right about that. Brent looked between Julian and Alexander, suddenly unsure whether it was still safe to laugh. Alexander said, "You mentioned 3 things." Naomi looked at the bottom of page 87. The third is the lease adjustment. Martin's face changed, only a little, but enough. Naomi saw it. So did Julian. She continued, 3 of the largest facilities sit on land leases, not owned land. The summary says lease adjustment, but the footnote says rent escalates if the property used changes materially. If the plan depends on converting even part of those sites, your costs may jump before the luxury apartments produce $1. Martin cut in. That clause is manageable. Then why is it in a footnote? His eyes hardened. Because that is where footnotes go. Naomi nodded once. And sometimes that is where truth goes when someone hopes the person signing is too proud to read small print. Everything froze. Elena closed her eyes. The whole room seemed to inhale and hold. Alexander Royce looked at Naomi as if seeing her for the first time, not as a server, not as a prop, not as a poor woman interrupting wealthy conversation, but as a mind standing in a room that had not made space for it. Then pride came back. He laughed once. Cold. You speak well. I will give you that. Did you practice this kind of thing at night after polishing silver? Naomi did not answer. Martin seized the opening. Mr. Royce, this is exactly why unqualified commentary is dangerous. She is mixing social concern with capital structure. It sounds impressive because the room is surprised, not because it is correct. Naomi looked down at the table, not in defeat, to choose her next words carefully. She knew Martin type. He did not have to be foolish. He only had to be protected by title, confidence, and the fact that men like Alexander hated being corrected in front of witnesses. Alexander tilted his head. Well, Naomi, are you qualified? Elena spoke quickly. Mr. Royce, she does not need to answer that. Naomi, please step away. For the first time, Naomi looked at her manager. With respect, Miss Hart, I already tried to step away. Elena went quiet. Naomi turned back to Alexander. No, sir, not in the way this room respects. Brent smirked. Finally, Naomi continued, I do not have a title at a fund. I do not have a corner office. I do not have a watch that costs more than my mother's medical bills. I'm a waitress. The words were steady, but I was also a finance student on full scholarship before my mother got sick. I read annual reports after closing shifts. I compare acquisition models for practice because numbers are the language men used when they ruined my family and called it efficiency. The room went silent. Even Martin did not move. Alexander's voice was lower now. What school? Naomi hesitated. Wharton School. Brent laughed too fast. Now that is convenient. Julian turned to him. Stop talking. The authority in Julian's voice surprised everyone. Naomi reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her cracked phone. The screen lit under a web of broken glass. 3 missed calls from Mercy South Medical Center still showed at the top. Beneath them was an email from the university registrar. Subject line, reinstatement eligibility and outstanding tuition balance. She did not hand it over. She only let the room see the subject line. I do not owe you my life story, Naomi said, but I do know the difference between an opportunity and a trap dressed in a return model. Alexander stared at the phone, the cracked glass, the hospital calls, the university email, the symbols of a life he would once have dismissed as unfortunate details. Martin spoke sharply. This is inappropriate. She is using personal hardship to gain credibility. Naomi put the phone away. No, Mr. Vale, you used my uniform to take credibility before I said a word. I am only taking back what belongs to me. Julian Price smiled faintly. Good. Alexander looked at Julian. You're enjoying this. No, Julian said. I'm remembering the last time I ignored a warning because it came from someone without a title. It cost me $90 million in a friendship. That made Alexander pause. Julian tapped the acquisition book, checked the clause. Martin said, There is no need. Julian looked at Alexander. If she is wrong, you lose 5 minutes. If she is right, you may save $500 million and perhaps more than money. Alexander did not like being cornered, but he liked losing money even less. He turned to his legal advisor, a quiet woman named Priya Desai. Sai, who had been reading silently near the far end of the table. Priya. Pull the land lease file. Original document, not the summary. Martin stood. That will take time. We are scheduled to sign at 11:30. Alexander looked at him. Then it is fortunate we have until 11:30. Martin's jaw tightened. Priya opened her laptop and connected to the secure data room. The room watched the progress circle spin. Naomi stood beside the table, suddenly aware of her own body again. The aching feet, the dry throat, the weight of every eye. She had wanted to disappear 10 minutes earlier. Now she wanted to sit down, but no chair had been offered. Julian noticed. Miss Brooks. Naomi looked at him. Please sit. Elena moved first, pulling a spare chair from the wall. Naomi did not take it immediately. A waitress sitting at a billionaire table was not a small thing in the Meridian room. Alexander saw the hesitation. For once, he didn't make a joke. Sit, he said. Naomi sat, not as a guest, not as an employee, as a witness. At 10:08, Priya opened the original lease agreement for Silver Haven Facility 7 in Coral Ridge, Florida. Then Facility 11 in Camden, New Jersey. Then Facility 19 outside Phoenix. She read in silence. The longer she read, the more Martin stopped breathing normally. Finally, Priya looked up. There is a material change clause. Naomi is correct. If use changes from licensed care operation to residential luxury housing, ground rent resets to market development rate. There is also an acceleration trigger if conversion begins within 18 months of acquisition. Julian closed his eyes. Brent whispered, How much? Priya scanned the schedule. Potential increase across 3 facilities could exceed $38 million over the first 3 years, not including litigation delay. Alexander turned to Martin. You said manageable. Martin answered quickly. It is manageable. We expected to renegotiate. Priya frowned. There is no renegotiation memo in the data room. Martin said, It was preliminary. Alexander's voice became quiet. Where is it? Martin did not answer. That was the mistake. Naomi looked at the contract, then at Martin's face. She had seen that look before, not on Wall Street, at hospital billing desks, at landlord offices, in termination letters. The look of someone who knew the truth existed and hoped the person asking would get tired first. Alexander reached for the acquisition summary. He turned to the page Naomi had noticed and read the footnote himself. For the first time that night, the billionaire who had mocked her shoes read the small print she had seen while holding a water pitcher. His face changed, only slightly. But enough. Naomi Brooks had not won yet. Martin had not fallen yet. Alexander had not apologized yet, and the deal still sat on the table like a loaded weapon. But the room had shifted, because now everyone knew the waitress had not interrupted a $500 million conversation. She had saved it from its first lie. But Alexander Royce did not know what it had cost Naomi Brooks to learn how lies hide inside numbers. He did not know about the mornings before sunrise. He did not know about the kitchen table in Queens. He did not know about the orange pill cutter, the overdue tuition letter, or the notebook with corners softened by years of being opened after midnight. He did not know that before Naomi ever stood beside his table with a water pitcher, she had already studied men like him under a weaker light than the chandelier above his wine glass. That morning began at 5:42. The apartment on Linden Avenue was still dark except for the small lamp above the stove. Outside the window, delivery trucks hissed through wet streets. Inside, Naomi moved quietly so she would not wake her mother too soon. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, but only one felt like a bedroom now. The second was half storage, half study corner, half memory of a future delayed too many times. A narrow desk sat beneath a shelf of old finance books, corporate finance, valuation, financial statement analysis, credit risk and restructuring. Some were bought used, some had library stickers crossed out. One had coffee stains on 3 chapters because Naomi had fallen asleep on it after a double shift. On the desk lay a black notebook. On the first page, Clara Brooks had written years earlier, "Money is a tool. Greed is a hand that forgets what it is holding." Naomi had read that sentence so many times that the page had a faint crease where her thumb always rested. In the kitchen, Clara coughed. Naomi stopped moving. "Mom, I'm awake," Clara said from the small table. She was sitting in her robe with a blanket over her knees, pretending she had slept well. Naomi knew the difference. The untouched glass of water, the pill bottle not opened, The way Clara's smile arrived too quickly. "You should still be sleeping," Naomi said. Clara lifted one eyebrow. "And you should still be at Wharton, but here we are." Naomi smiled because her mother wanted her to. Then she placed oatmeal on the table, along with 2 pills, half a banana, and the blood pressure cuff that made a tired buzzing sound. Clara looked at the plate. "You cut the banana like we are at a hotel." "We are. Very exclusive. Only 2 guests, terrible room service." Clara laughed, then coughed again. Naomi watched too closely. Clara noticed, "Do not make that face." "What face?" "The face where you turn into a nurse, accountant, lawyer, and worried daughter all at once." Naomi sat across from her. "I'm just checking. You have been checking since you were 16, because somebody had to." The words came out sharper than Naomi intended. Clara did not flinch. She reached for Naomi's hand. "Baby, I know." On the table between them were 3 pieces of paper. Mercy South Medical Center billing notice. Patient account number MS49371. Minimum payment due by Friday. A pharmacy refill reminder for Clara Brooks, insurance review pending, and an email printed from the Wharton Registrar Office. Subject line, reinstatement eligibility and outstanding tuition balance. Naomi had printed it 3 days earlier and told herself she would not look at it again until she had a plan. She looked at it every morning. Clara followed her eyes. "You could go back," Naomi shook her head. "Not yet. That school will still be there. Maybe. Your mind will still be there too." Naomi smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "My mind is at table 12 tonight." Clara understood. "You are working double again. Private room, finance dinner. The tips should be good if nobody decides being rich means forgetting manners." Clara squeezed her hand. "Do not let them make you small." Naomi looked down. "They do not have to. The uniform helps." Clara's voice sharpened. "No, the uniform tells them what you are doing. It does not tell them who you are." Naomi had heard that sentence before. At hospitals, at bus stops. Before interviews she could not attend, before shifts where customers looked past her face and spoke only to her hands. Still, it helped. A little. At 6:28, Naomi helped Clara measure her blood pressure. The machine squeezed Clara's arm and released with a tired sigh. Naomi wrote the numbers in a blue folder labeled Home Care Notes. Inside were dates, medication times, diet notes, billing calls, denial letters, and a page of questions for the next doctor visit. Clara watched her write. "You keep records like you expect the world to argue." Naomi said, "The world does argue, then make sure you argue with proof." That was Clara Brooks. Soft voice, hard lesson. At 7:10, Naomi left the apartment wearing her black restaurant uniform beneath a gray coat. Her shoes were already worn at the left heel, but she polished them every night. In her tote bag were her apron, a packed lunch, 2 printed annual reports, and the black notebook. On the subway, she stood because every seat was taken. Her hand held the metal pole. Her other hand held a marked page from a public filing on Silver Haven Care. Most people around her scrolled news, closed eyes, or listened to music. Naomi read debt schedules. There was a rhythm to it. Station, page, station, footnote, station, risk factor. By the time the train reached Midtown, she had circled one phrase twice. Material change of use. It bothered her. She did not yet know why, but the phrase had teeth. At 9:05, she arrived at the Meridian Room through the staff entrance on 49th Street. The public entrance faced the avenue with gold letters, white flowers, and a doorman who remembered billionaires by name. The staff entrance opened into a concrete hallway where delivery carts scraped the floor and people changed shoes beside metal lockers. Naomi liked that hallway more than the dining room sometimes. At least, nobody in the hallway pretended work was invisible. In the locker room, a young busser named Talia Ramirez sat tying her apron with shaking fingers. "First private dining shift?" Naomi asked. Talia nodded. "Room C, corporate table." Naomi smiled gently. "Do not reach across the wine side. Do not react if they speak about numbers that could buy buildings. And if they make jokes about your name, pretend you did not hear unless they say it twice." Talia stared. "Does that happen?" Naomi opened her locker. "Here, yes." Talia swallowed. "Why do you stay?" Naomi looked at the taped photograph inside her locker. Clara and Naomi on Naomi's first day at Wharton. Naomi in a blue blazer. Clara smiling so proudly that the camera had blurred slightly, because leaving costs money too. That was the truth. At 10:30, Elena Hart held the pre-shift meeting near the service station. She wore a cream suit, small earrings, and the face of someone who measured every crisis before it arrived. Private dining has priority tonight, Elena said. Mr. Alexander Royce has booked the North Room. Full discretion, no interruptions, no personal conversation, no mistakes. Someone whispered, Royce, capital Royce. Elena heard it. Yes, that Royce. He has investors flying in for a Silver Haven care transaction. The room minimum is $75,000. If it goes well, they may book quarterly meetings here. That means hours. That means tips. That means rent for some of you. She paused and her eyes moved across the staff. So I need professionalism. Naomi felt the words before they became trouble. Professionalism often meant dignity for guests and silence for staff. Elena continued. Naomi, you have the room lead because you know finance tables. Naomi nodded. Talia looked impressed. After the meeting, Elena called Naomi aside. Be careful in there. Naomi lifted an eyebrow. I'm always careful. I mean more careful. Naomi understood. Alexander Royce does not like staff hovering, Elena said, but he also hates empty glasses. He wants invisible service, invisible but fast. Exactly. Naomi almost laughed. That is a magic trick, not a job description. Elena lowered her voice. Naomi, I know. Elena looked tired. No, I do not think you do. This table matters. Naomi looked at her. To who? To the restaurant. To you. To all of us. Naomi held her gaze. Then I hope he behaves like the room matters to him too. Elena did not answer. That was not permission, but it was not disagreement either. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Naomi took her lunch break in the staff corridor, sitting on an upside-down milk crate with her food container balanced on her knees. She ate rice and beans while reading the Silver Haven annual disclosure on her phone. Talia sat beside her. You really read that stuff for fun? No. Then why? Naomi scrolled to a table of facility locations. Because rich people rarely explain the whole machine. They just show the shiny part. Talia pointed at the screen. What is Silver Haven? A chain of senior care facilities, like nursing homes, care centers, assisted living, rehabilitation beds, memory care in some locations, different licenses, different reimbursement rules, different risks. Talia blinked. You sound like one of the people upstairs. Naomi closed the file. No. I sound like somebody whose mother used to work inside one of those places before men upstairs decided her job was an inefficiency. Talia went quiet. Naomi did not mean to say that much. She almost apologized, then stopped. Some truths do not need apology. At 3:40, between lunch and dinner service, Naomi took 5 minutes alone in the employee restroom. She locked the door, leaned against the sink, and checked her phone. One missed call from Mercy South Medical Center. Then another. Then an automated voicemail. Her stomach tightened. She played it on low volume. This is a reminder regarding pending insurance review for Clara Brooks. Please contact patient billing before Friday to discuss account status. Naomi closed her eyes. Friday. Everything was always by Friday. Bills, reviews, deadlines, threats with polite voices. She wanted to sit on the floor, just for 1 minute. Instead, she turned on the cold water and held her fingers beneath it until she could breathe again. Then she looked in the mirror. Black uniform, tired eyes, name tag, Naomi. She whispered the lesson Clara gave her when she was little and afraid of schoolrooms where teachers mispronounced her name. Stand straight before the room decides how small you are. Naomi stood straight, then she went back to work. At 5:50, the private room was set. Crystal glasses in perfect rows, white plates with thin gold rims, leather menus, fresh flowers, a hidden camera in the upper corner for security, not sound, a service log tablet near the sideboard. Naomi checked table assignments, water temperature, wine order, dietary notes, and guest list. Alexander Royce, Martin Vale, Julian Price, Brent Mallory, Priya Desai, 4 additional advisors and investors, 1 seat left open for a late lender representative. Naomi saw the name Royce and felt something in her chest tighten, not because he was famous, because the name had lived in her house before. In Clara's old file box, there was a folder labeled Brookline Senior Services. The folder contained pay stubs, termination letters, insurance cancellation notices, and 1 photocopied article. Royce Capital completes acquisition of Brookline Senior Services. Naomi had been 19 when that acquisition happened. She remembered the day Clara came home with a cardboard box, 1 mug, 1 sweater, 1 framed photograph of Naomi in high school, 21 years of work reduced to what fit in 2 arms. Clara had tried to smile. "It is all right, baby. Numbers changed, people got moved. But 2 months later, her health insurance ended. Appointments were delayed, medication costs rose. The small cough became a long illness. The illness became debt. Debt became choices no family should have to make. Naomi had gone back to campus that semester and sat through a lecture on shareholder value with her hands clenched under the desk. After class, she changed her major focus, not wealth management, not private equity placement, risk analysis, distressed assets, healthcare finance. She wanted to understand the language that had made her mother pain look efficient. Then came the hospital stay. The scholarship could cover tuition, not life. Naomi left school in her 3rd year. Everyone called it a temporary withdrawal. That was a kind phrase for grief with paperwork. At 6:23, Alexander Royce arrived. The room changed around him before he spoke. That was what power did. Servers straightened, investors stood. Elena smiled wider. Martin moved toward him like a man greeting a king whose mood controlled the weather. Naomi stood by the service station holding the first bottle of still water. Alexander did not look at her. People like him did not look at staff until something went wrong. The dinner began. First course, oysters for the table, sparkling water for Julian, no garlic for Priya, red wine decanted for Alexander. Martin opened the presentation at 7:02. Naomi poured water, replaced plates, and moved silently. But her ears followed the numbers. Facility count, occupancy assumptions, debt coverage ratio, resident mix, staff reduction potential, real estate conversion option, each phrase connected to something she had read on trains, in hospital waiting rooms, after midnight beside Clara's sleeping door. At 7:48, Martin said, "The portfolio performs like a blended national senior care asset, which allows us to model using industry average occupancy." Naomi's hands tightened around a plate. Wrong, not fully wrong. Worse, conveniently wrong. Silver Haven was not one national average. It was a patchwork of local fragility, rural counties losing population, suburban sites with aging buildings, 3 land leases, pending complaints, staffing shortages already showing in state inspection notes. Average could hide a wound if you spread it thin enough. Naomi set the plate down without sound. Julian Price asked, "What about the complaint clusters?" Martin clicked to the next slide too quickly. Contained. Ordinary noise. Naomi looked at him then, only for a second. He saw. His eyes narrowed. A warning. She lowered her gaze. At 8:18, Elena pulled Naomi aside near the wine cabinet. "Everything all right?" "Yes. You seem distracted." Naomi looked toward the table. "They are discussing a transaction that may affect thousands of residents and workers." Elena's voice dropped. "Naomi, I'm not interfering." "Good. Please do not." Naomi looked at her manager. "If the model is wrong." Elena interrupted softly, "It is not our table." The words were gentle. They still hurt. Naomi nodded and returned to service. At 9:06, the chocolate course was being plated when Naomi passed behind Martin and saw page 87. Lease adjustment triggered upon material change of use. The phrase from the subway. The tooth in the paper. That was why her hand paused. That was why Alexander noticed. That was why the room turned on her. And that was why, when the billionaire mocked her shoes and asked what she would do with $500 million, Naomi could not choose silence anymore, because silence had already cost her mother too much. Now, back in the private dining room, as Priya confirmed the hidden lease clause and Martin's face began to pale, Naomi sat at the investor table for the first time in her life. Her shoes still hurt, her hospital wristband still pressed against her skin, her mother missed calls still waited on her cracked phone. But the room that had laughed at her now waited for her to speak again. Alexander Royce looked at the contract, then at Martin, then at Naomi. And Naomi realized the worst part was not that Martin had hidden one clause. The worst part was that she had seen 2 more shadows in the deal, one in the care complaints, one in the advisor fee schedule. And if Alexander asked the next question, the entire table would learn that the $500 million disaster had not been an accident. It had been designed. Naomi Brooks felt that truth before anyone else in the room was ready to name it. The lease clause was not the whole danger. It was the first loose thread. If Alexander Royce pulled it, the beautiful $500 million transaction on the table might begin to unravel in front of every investor who had laughed at the woman holding the water pitcher. Martin Vale knew that too. That was why he moved first. He closed the acquisition book with one clean motion and looked at Priya Desai. This is getting theatrical. We have one clause that may require renegotiation. That does not justify turning a private investment meeting into a talent show for restaurant staff. Elena Hart flinched near the wine cabinet. Naomi did not. Alexander looked at Martin, then at the closed book. Open it. Martin smiled like he had not heard correctly. Alexander. Open it. The room went still. Martin slowly placed his hand back on the acquisition book, but he did not open it. Mr. Royce, with respect, you are allowing an employee of the restaurant to influence a deal that has been reviewed for 9 weeks by experienced professionals. Naomi looked at him. 9 weeks, and the most important lease trigger still made it into the room as a footnote. Martin turned to her. You do not understand materiality. Naomi answered, I understand when someone decides a number should be small enough to ignore until it becomes too expensive to fix. Brent Mallory muttered, This is absurd. Julian Price spoke without looking at him. Absurd is laughing at a woman until she saves your money. Brent went quiet. Alexander leaned forward. Naomi, the way he said her name had changed. Not kind, not respectful yet, but focused. You said there were 3 things my team was not saying. We checked the first. What is the second shadow you mentioned? Martin straightened. This has gone far enough. Alexander did not look at him. I decide when far enough arrives. Martin mouth closed. Naomi looked at the acquisition package. Then she looked toward Elena. If I speak, I may lose my job. Elena's throat tightened. The right answer should have been immediate. No, you will not. But the room minimum was $75,000. The investors were watching. The restaurant owner had sent 3 messages already asking whether Mr. Royce was pleased. Elena thought about staff hours, rent, reputation, and the fragile line between management and survival. Her silence lasted 2 seconds. It felt longer. Naomi saw it. So did Julian. So did Alexander. Elena finally said, Naomi, you are still on shift. Naomi nodded slowly. That was an answer. Alexander turned to Elena. If she loses her job because I asked a question, I will consider that a failure of the establishment. Elena's face changed. Yes, Mr. Royce. Naomi did not thank him. She would not accept protection from the same hand that had started the humiliation. She simply turned back to the table. The second issue is the complaint clusters. Martin laughed once. We already covered that. No, Naomi said. You buried it. She pointed to Priya's laptop. Search for Silver Haven State Inspection deficiency reports, not the summary, the original attachments. Priya looked at Alexander. He nodded. Martin spoke sharply. Those are operational issues. They are common in this sector. Every care facility has complaints. Naomi said, complaints are common, patterns are not. Priya typed. The room watched the screen. Outside the windows, the city kept shining, unaware that a waitress in worn shoes was forcing a billionaire table to read the parts of a deal that never made it onto the polished slide deck. Priya opened the first file, Silver Haven Facility 14, State Inspection Report, then Facility 6, then Facility 17. Naomi leaned forward slightly, reading upside down from habit. She had practiced reading menus, receipts, and guest notes from strange angles for years. Tonight, that strange skill became a weapon. There, she said. Priya stopped scrolling. Repeat citations for understaffed night shifts, Naomi said. Medication delay notices. 3 family complaints marked unresolved. Now check whether the facilities in that cluster are among the ones marked for conversion in year 2. Priya opened the conversion schedule. Her face grew still. They are. Julian Price sat back. Of course they are. Brent frowned. Why does that matter? Naomi looked at him. Because if a facility already has care complaints, and then the buyer cuts services or moves residents to unlock real estate value, regulators do not treat that like ordinary restructuring. Families do not treat it like ordinary restructuring. News outlets do not treat it like ordinary restructuring. Alexander looked at Priya. How many unresolved complaints across those facilities? Priya scanned. The summary says 12. Naomi said, across the portfolio. Priya opened the attachment. Then she paused. What? Priya's voice lowered. The attachment lists 49 unresolved complaints, including 9 escalated to state review. The number landed on the table like broken glass. Alexander turned toward Martin. 12. Martin kept his voice controlled. The 12 were financially material complaints. The rest are ordinary service noise. Naomi looked at him. A daughter calling because her father waited 40 minutes after pressing the help button is not service noise. The room went silent. Naomi did not know that specific complaint from the file. She knew it from life. She had seen Clara wait on hospital call lights. She had watched nurses run between too many rooms. She had learned that understaffing was not an abstract ratio. It was a person waiting in pain because a spreadsheet called labor a cost to be optimized. Martin's face hardened. "You are making this emotional again." Naomi nodded. Yes, that surprised him. Then she continued, because the people inside the facilities are emotional. Their families are emotional. Juries are emotional. Regulators are emotional when a company buys a care chain, reduces staff, and pretends delayed medication is a rounding error. If your model cannot survive human reaction, your model is weak. Julian Price murmured, "That is the best sentence said tonight." Alexander did not praise her. His expression had become difficult to read. That frightened Martin more than anger would have. Martin reached for his tablet. "Mr. Royce, I recommend we pause and reconvene without non-authorized personnel in the room." Naomi noticed the phrase, non-authorized. There it was again, a title used as a wall. Priya looked at Alexander. From a legal perspective, Martin may be right that this discussion should be limited. Naomi pushed her chair back slightly. "I can leave." Alexander looked at her. "Do you want to?" The question surprised her. For a moment, Naomi did want to leave. Badly, her feet hurt. Her mother had called 3 times. Her manager had failed her in front of the room. The men who laughed at her were now watching her as if she had become a useful object instead of a ridiculous one. That was not the same as respect. She looked at the door, then at the acquisition package, then at Martin. Her mother's voice returned. "Stand straight before the room decides how small you are." Naomi sat back down. "No," she said. "I do not want to leave before the truth does." Everything froze again. Alexander almost smiled. Almost. Martin did not. At 10:26, Priya received a secure data room notification. A lender representative named Samuel Keene had joined the waiting call from Morgan Whitcomb Bank. He was scheduled for 10:45, but the link opened early after the signing checklist was activated. Priya looked at Alexander. "The senior lender is online early." Martin moved quickly. "Leave him waiting," Alexander said. "Bring him in." Martin's face flashed. "Alexander, bring him in." Priya connected the audio to the room speaker. Samuel Keene's voice came through clear and formal. "Good evening. Samuel Keene from Morgan Whitcomb Bank. I understand we are reviewing final conditions for Silver Haven Care financing." Alexander leaned toward the speaker. "Mr. Keene, this is Alexander Royce. We have discovered potential omissions in the summary materials. I need confirmation on 2 items. First, whether your credit committee has reviewed the material change lease triggers. Second, whether the unresolved care complaints were disclosed as 49 matters or 12. Silence came through the speaker. Martin looked down. Samuel replied carefully. "Mr. Royce, the credit committee received the executive summary provided by your advisory team. It lists 12 material complaints and describes lease adjustment exposure as subject to ordinary renegotiation." Priya closed her eyes. Naomi looked at Martin. Alexander's voice became colder. "Did your team receive the original lease clauses?" Another pause. "Not in the initial lender packet," Martin said. "We intended to provide them during confirmatory diligence." Samuel replied, "Martin, the signing package was marked final as of 6/11 this evening." 6/11. Naomi turned to Priya. "Can you pull upload records?" Martin snapped, "This is unnecessary." Alexander looked at him. "That is the 3rd time you have said unnecessary when a document is requested." Martin went silent. Priya opened the data room activity log. The screen showed file names, upload times, and user accounts. At 6:11, Martin Vale had uploaded a folder labeled Final Investor Summary. At 6:14, a different folder had been moved into Restricted Archive. Priya clicked it. Restricted by Administrator. Alexander asked, "Who is Administrator?" Priya answered, "Martin." The room changed. Not dramatically, no shouting, no table slam, just the quiet shift that happens when suspicion becomes visible. Alexander said, "Open it." Priya tried. Access denied. Martin spoke calmly, too calmly. "That folder contains raw immaterial documents not appropriate for investor review before signing. Standard practice." Naomi looked at him. What is the folder name? Priya read it. Legacy liabilities and broker compensation support. Julian Price leaned forward. Broker compensation. Martin turned to Julian. It is normal fee documentation. Julian said, then open it. Martin said, you do not have authority in our data room. Alexander spoke. I do. Martin's jaw tightened. Technically, administrative rights are with my team until closing. Alexander smiled for the first time in several minutes. That was the wrong sentence. He took out his phone and called someone directly. Lydia, he said when the line connected, I need Royce Capital Compliance to take control of the Silver Haven data room now. Remove Martin Vale administrator privileges. Yes, now, I am in the Meridian room. Priya Desdi is present. Julian Price is present. Lender is on audio. Time is 10:31. Mark this as a pre-signing escalation. Martin stood. Alexander, think carefully. Alexander did not look away from him. I am. The call ended. Naomi watched Martin hand curl around the back of his chair. For the first time, she saw fear. Not guilt. Fear of losing control. At 10:33, Priya laptop refreshed. Access granted. She opened the restricted folder. 3 documents appeared. Outstanding litigation reserve analysis. Ground lease conversion exposure. Broker and advisor fee schedule. Alexander said, fee schedule. Priya opened it. The first page showed ordinary transaction fees. The second page showed an advisory success fee to Vale Strategic Partners. Brent said, is that Martin firm? Julian answered, it is. Priya read the amount, $12 million payable upon closing through broker affiliate. Alexander slowly turned toward Martin. You have a side success fee. Martin lifted his hands. It is fully disclosed in the broker documents, not to me, to the transaction file, not to me. Martin swallowed. The fee is customary. Alexander stood. The room rose in energy without anyone else moving. You advised me to sign a $500 million transaction tonight while hiding lease triggers, reducing 49 complaints to 12, restricting liability files, and holding a $12 million success fee that pays only if I sign. Martin's voice cracked at the edge. That is an unfair characterization, Naomi spoke softly. It is not unfair. It is incomplete. Everyone turned. Alexander stared at her. What else? Martin said, do not answer that. Naomi did. The reserve analysis. Priya opened the litigation reserve file. Naomi looked at the first table. The reserve assumes settlement before acquisition, but if the closing happens before those complaints resolve, Royce Capital inherits public association with the cases, even if legal liability is limited. That means the risk is not just litigation cost, it is timing, Julian said, and the signing is tonight. Naomi nodded. Before midnight, Samuel Keene's voice came from the speaker. Morgan Whitcomb Bank would not have treated the packet as final if these files were restricted. This may require credit committee reapproval. Martin shouted then. Enough! The word cracked across the room. Elena took one step back. Talia, who had entered with coffee service and frozen near the sideboard, nearly dropped the tray. Everyone looked at Martin. He realized he had raised his voice. He adjusted his cuffs. I apologize. But this is exactly what happens when untrained people create panic with half knowledge. Naomi stood. Not fast, carefully. Untrained does not mean wrong. Martin laughed bitterly. You left school. The room went cold. Naomi felt the blow land. Alexander looked at Martin sharply. Martin continued, because desperate men often mistake cruelty for control. You left school, you serve tables, and you think reading public filings at night makes you a restructuring expert. Naomi's hands shook once. She clasped them in front of her. Martin stepped closer to the table. People like you always think proximity to money is the same as understanding it. Naomi felt every worker in the room absorb that phrase. People like you. Elena finally moved. Mr. Vale, that is enough. Her voice trembled, but she said it. Martin turned on her. Do not lecture me about my tone in a restaurant where I'm paying more for dinner than your staff makes in a month. Elena's face paled. But she did not step back. Naomi looked at her. The silence from earlier had not vanished, but now Elena was standing inside the cost of it. Alexander spoke quietly. Martin. Martin turned. Sit down. Martin blinked. Mr. Royce, sit down, Alexander repeated. Martin sat. Alexander looked at Naomi. Miss Brooks, I owe you more than courtesy, but I will start there. Please continue. Naomi breathed. The room waited. She had almost stopped. One sentence about leaving school had nearly reached the place she kept hidden, the place where shame and sacrifice had tangled for years. She saw the registrar email, the tuition balance, Clara cough, the uniform, the shoes. Then she remembered Clara at the kitchen table. The uniform tells them what you are doing. It does not tell them who you are. Naomi stood straighter. The real issue is not only that the deal is risky, she said. Risk can be priced. The issue is that the risk was selectively hidden from the people expected to approve it. That means you do not have an investment problem first. You have a governance problem. Julian Price nodded. There it is. Alexander looked at Samuel on the speaker. Mr. Keene, will your bank proceed tonight? Samuel answered, not without revised disclosure, credit review, and written certification from Royce Capital Compliance. Alexander looked at Priya. Can we sign tonight? Priya said. Legally, you can sign anything you choose. Responsibly, no. Alexander nodded. Martin shut his eyes. The $500 million deal did not die with shouting. It stopped with one word from the man who had mocked the woman who saved him. Suspend it, Alexander said. No one moved. He continued. All signing activity stops immediately. Priya, preserve the data room logs. Lydia from compliance gets full access. Samuel, tell your credit committee we discovered disclosure failures before signing. Julian, I would like you to remain as witness. Martin, you will not touch another file. Martin stood again. You cannot be serious. Alexander looked at him. I am rarely serious enough. That is how we got here. Naomi sat down slowly. Her legs felt weak now, not from fear, from the shock of being believed in a room built to dismiss her. Elena walked to the sideboard and poured a glass of water. She placed it in front of Naomi. Her voice was quiet. I should have said something sooner. Naomi looked at the glass, then at Elena. Yes, she said, you should have. Elena nodded. No excuse. Naomi picked up the glass. Not forgiveness? Not yet. But recognition. At 10:42, Alexander turned back to Naomi. One more question. Naomi almost laughed. You still want advice? This time, no one laughed at her. Alexander said, yes. Naomi looked at the suspended deal, the angry advisor, the silent investors, the lawyer preserving evidence, the lender on the line, the manager who had finally found her voice, and the cracked phone in her pocket still waiting with hospital calls. Then, answer the one question you have avoided, she said. Alexander frowned. Which question? Naomi's voice softened, and somehow that made it cut deeper. Who pays if you are wrong? The room had no answer. And for the first time that night, Alexander Royce did not look like the richest man at the table. He looked like the last one to understand the cost. For several seconds, no one in the private dining room answered Naomi Brooks. Who pays if you are wrong? The question stayed over the table like smoke. Alexander Royce had spent most of his life asking what a deal could earn. Naomi had asked what a deal could destroy. That was why the room felt different now. Not ruined, exposed. Martin Vale sat with both hands flat on the table, trying to look insulted instead of afraid. Priya Desai preserved the restricted Silverhaven files in a secure folder. Julian Price watched quietly. Brent Mallory no longer made jokes. Elena Hart stood near the sideboard, holding a water bottle she had forgotten to pour. Naomi sat in the chair Julian had offered her. Her shoes still hurt. Her cracked phone still held missed calls from Mercy South Medical Center. Her black uniform still told the room she was staff. But now every investor at the table was waiting for the waitress to speak. Alexander looked at her. Why do you know so much about senior care finance? Naomi knew the question would come. She did not answer right away. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone. The cracked screen lit her face. She opened a photo folder labeled Mom Documents and turned the screen toward him. It showed an old employee badge. Brookline Senior Services, Clara Brooks. Accounting Department. Naomi said, My mother worked for Brookline Senior Services for 21 years. Alexander stared at the badge. At first, nothing moved in his face. Then something did. Not memory. The first fear of memory. Naomi continued. Royce Capital bought Brookline 7 years ago. You called it a regional efficiency opportunity. Staff were cut. 2 facilities were sold. The health plan transition ended early. My mother lost her job in the second wave. Then she lost her insurance. Then every doctor visit became a decision about what bill could wait. Martin spoke quickly. That was a completed transaction under a separate operating team. It has no relevance to tonight. Naomi looked at him. That is how harm survives. Every deal becomes a separate room, so nobody has to smell the smoke from the last one. Julian lowered his eyes. Alexander said nothing. Naomi swiped to the next image. A letter. The paper in the photograph was creased and worn at the corners. Clara had kept the original in a folder beneath her bed, beside pay stubs, termination notices, and medical bills. Naomi said, "My mother sent this to your office after the Brookline cuts." Alexander's voice was low. What did it say? Naomi looked at him. "You want me to read it here?" He knew what that meant. If he said no, he would be refusing a woman twice. "Read it," he said. Naomi held the phone with both hands. "Mr. Royce, my name is Clara Brooks. I worked in accounting at Brookline Senior Services for 21 years. I'm not writing because I lost my job. I'm writing because the people left inside cannot speak loudly enough for the spreadsheets to hear them." No one moved. Naomi continued, "When you reduce night staff, harm does not look like harm at first. It looks like delays. It looks like tired nurses. It looks like residents waiting too long after pressing call buttons. Please send someone who will walk the halls before approving the next cut." Naomi lowered the phone. My mother never received an answer. Alexander looked down. Martin tried again. "This is emotional history, not investment analysis." Naomi answered quietly. "My mother warned you in human language. Tonight I warned you in financial language. You ignored the first one because it sounded emotional. You almost ignored the second one because I was wearing an apron." That sentence landed harder than anger. Priya looked at Alexander. "Do you want me to search the Brookline archive?" Martin said. "Completely unnecessary." Alexander turned toward him. "Every time you say unnecessary, I find something you wanted hidden." Then he looked at Priya. "Search it." At 10:54, Priya entered the Royce Capital Legacy Archive. She typed Clara Brooks into the search field. One file appeared, then 3, then 7. Priya opened the first record. Incoming letter. Clara Brooks, Brookline Senior Services. Attached internal summary. Alexander said, "Read the summary." Priya hesitated. "Read it." Priya read. "Former employee complaint. Emotional objection to necessary restructuring. No material legal claim. No response recommended." Naomi closed her eyes. There it was. Her mother had not been unheard by accident. She had been filed away. Alexander's voice changed. "Who approved no response?" Priya scrolled. "Routing record shows the summary was included in a post-acquisition update packet sent to your office. Status marked reviewed." Alexander stared at the screen. "I do not remember reading it." Naomi looked at him. "My mother remembers writing it. That was worse than accusation." The door opened. A woman in a dark gray suit stepped inside with a leather folder and a security badge on her jacket. Her name was Lydia Chen, Chief Compliance Officer of Royce Capital. Alexander had called her minutes earlier to take control of the Silver Haven data room. She had been in a late meeting 2 floors below in the Royce satellite office inside Halcyon Tower. She was not random. The evidence had summoned her. Lydia looked around the table. "Mr. Royce, Priya, Mr. Price." Then she looked at Naomi. "Miss Brooks." Naomi was surprised Lydia knew her name. Lydia said, "I have taken control of the Silver Haven data room. Martin Vale administrator privileges are suspended. All document activity since 6 this evening has been preserved. Compliance case number Royce 7841. Martin stood. "Lydia, this is a serious overreaction." Lydia opened her folder. "Please sit down. I do not report to you." "No," she said. "You report to governance standards when you use Royce Capital systems to restrict material documents." Martin sat. Lydia placed 3 pages on the table. "I reviewed the restricted liability folder, the upload log, and the broker compensation file. Val Strategic Partners is listed for a success fee payable at closing. That entity is not listed on your most recent conflict disclosure." Alexander looked at Martin. "How much?" Lydia answered before Martin could, $12 million. The room went silent. Alexander's voice was flat. "You pushed me to sign tonight while hiding lease triggers, reducing 49 complaints to 12, restricting liability documents, and carrying a $12 million success fee." Martin swallowed. "The fee was in the transaction file. Not disclosed to me. It was customary." Alexander stood slowly. So was calling Clara Brooks emotional. I'm beginning to dislike what this firm has called customary. That was the authority shift. Not because Alexander suddenly became noble, not because Naomi was rescued, because proof replaced status. The person in the apron had been right. The person with the title had hidden risk. The person with the money now had to answer to the record. Lydia turned to Elena Hart. The Meridian Room has video in the private dining room and service station audio in the hallway, correct? Elena straightened. Yes. Video only inside this room. Audio at the service station for safety incidents. Preserve everything from 7 this evening until now. Especially the moment Miss Brooks was mocked and then kept at the table. Elena looked at Naomi. I will preserve it. Naomi asked, is that a promise or a policy? Elena froze. The question was soft. It still exposed her. Elena said, by tomorrow morning, it will be both. I will write a staff dignity policy and send it to ownership tonight. Guests who humiliate employees lose service privilege, no matter the room minimum. Naomi studied her. You could have said that earlier. Elena's eyes filled. I should have. Why did you not? Elena looked at Alexander's table. Because I was afraid of the money leaving. Naomi nodded once. And I was afraid of my mother hospital calling while I lost my job. Elena lowered her head. I know. No, Naomi said. You know now. Lydia made a note. Alexander turned to Naomi. Your mother is alive. Yes, Mercy South Medical Center, Queens, patient account number MS49371. Naomi did not know why she gave the number. Maybe because numbers were the only language rooms like this respected. Alexander looked at Lydia. No one contacts her mother. No payment, no public statement, no outreach without Miss Brooks' consent. Naomi blinked. She had expected him to move fast with money, the way powerful people often tried to buy relief before they understood harm. Alexander looked back at her. I was going to offer help, but help offered too quickly by the person connected to the wound can feel like control. Naomi said nothing. Because he was right. And because being right once did not erase being wrong for years, Julian Price looked at the clock. There is still a board call at midnight if signing remains on calendar. Alexander nodded. Move it up, Martin snapped. You cannot walk into the board with a waitress as your source. Naomi stood. Then, do not. Everyone turned to her. She picked up her cracked phone and put it into her apron pocket. You have lawyers. You have compliance. You have data room logs. You have restricted files. You have lender records. You have my mother letter in your own archive. If you want to know whether I was right, verify it. Do not believe me because I was humiliated. Do not dismiss me because I serve. Verify it, because that is what serious institutions claim they do. Priya nodded. That is fair, Lydia said. Miss Brooks, with your permission, I would like to record your observations later as a witness statement. You may provide it in writing and with counsel if you choose. Naomi paused. Counsel. Lydia answered, you became a material witness to potential disclosure failures after being publicly mocked in a business meeting. You should not be asked to navigate that informally. For the first time that night, someone with authority named Naomi's situation without using it. Naomi nodded. Later, Elena stepped forward. Your shift is covered. You will be paid for the full night. Naomi looked at her. I earned that before the room believed me. Elena said, yes, you did. Naomi reached for the water pitcher on the table. The gesture hurt more than anyone expected. After exposing hidden risk, after revealing a $12 million conflict, after forcing Alexander Royce to confront Clara Brooks' letter, she still picked up the object she had carried when they decided she was small. Julian stood. Miss Brooks, she turned. Thank you for refusing to disappear. Naomi looked at him. Thank you for not laughing. It was not enough. Julian said. No, Naomi answered, but it was something. At the door, Alexander spoke. Naomi? She stopped. I'm sorry for what I said tonight. She looked back. That apology belongs to tonight. He nodded. Yes. The older apology belongs to my mother. Yes. And the real apology belongs to what you do next. Alexander lowered his head. Yes. Naomi left. In the service hallway, the air was cooler. Stainless steel carts lined the wall. Talia Ramirez stood near the staff station, holding the coffee tray she had almost dropped when Martin shouted, Naomi, Talia whispered. Naomi tried to smile. I'm fine. Talia shook her head. No, you are not. Naomi almost corrected her, then stopped. She was tired of saying fine as if it were another bill. "No," she said, "I am not." Talia held up a small flash drive. The service station audio caught part of what Martin said. "About people like you, about what staff make in a month. I saved the incident clip before it could be overwritten." Naomi stared at her. "You did." "I was scared," Talia said, "but you were alone in there and someone needed proof." Proof. Naomi remembered Clara's voice that morning. "Make sure you argue with proof." She squeezed Talia's hand. "Thank you." Inside the private room, the signing table was no longer a signing table. It had become evidence. Lydia directed the preservation steps. Priya prepared a legal summary. Julian stayed as witness. Samuel Keene from Morgan Whitcomb Bank remained on the lender line and confirmed financing was paused. Martin sat alone, locked out of the files he had controlled less than an hour earlier. At 11:24, Alexander joined the emergency board call. No champagne was poured, no signing pen was placed beside the contract, no dessert was served. Board members appeared on screen, irritated at first, then silent as Lydia read the timeline. Final summary uploaded at 6:11, liability folder restricted at 6:14, lease trigger confirmed after Naomi observation, lender disclosure gap identified, hidden advisor fee opened, Brookline archive record found, signing halted. A board member named Richard Hale asked who first raised the lease concern. Lydia answered, "Naomi Brooks, a server employed by the restaurant." Richard frowned. A server. Alexander looked into the camera. "Do not make the mistake I made." Richard closed his mouth. Alexander continued. "She saw what my advisor hid because she read the footnotes and understood what our model erased. Her job title is not evidence against her. Tonight, it is evidence against us." Julian spoke from beside him. "I was present." She was mocked before she was heard. Then she was right. That sentence entered the official minutes. By midnight, the board suspended the Silver Haven signing, opened an independent audit, placed Martin Vale on immediate leave, referred the undisclosed fee matter to outside counsel, and required a human impact review for every healthcare acquisition before approval. Alexander made the motion himself. But Naomi did not hear the vote. She was downstairs in the locker room, under a humming light, returning the hospital call. "Yes, this is Naomi Brooks. I'm calling about Clara Brooks' account." She listened. Her face tightened. "Friday. Yes, I understand." "No, please do not send it to collections. I can make a partial payment tomorrow." She closed her eyes. The night had stopped a $500 million deal. It had exposed a powerful advisor. It had forced a board to listen, but Naomi still had to bargain with hospital billing under fluorescent lights. That was the part the rooms upstairs never understood. Justice can begin in public. Survival often continues in private. Naomi ended the call and sat beneath her locker. For the first time that night, she let herself shake. Then Elena entered quietly and placed a printed incident report beside her. "I cannot undo my silence," Elena said, "but I will not make you carry the proof alone." Naomi looked at the report. Not forgiveness, but a door. Upstairs, Alexander Royce sat before his board with Clara Brooks' letter open on the table, finally understanding that the woman he had failed to hear years ago had sent her daughter into his life with the one language he could not ignore. Truth with receipts. That was the only kind of truth Alexander Royce's boardroom could not easily dismiss. By 1:15 in this morning, the Meridian Room no longer sounded like a place where powerful men had come to celebrate. No champagne was opened. No signing pen touched the Silver Haven care contract. The acquisition folder that was supposed to become a victory was sealed as evidence for compliance review. Martin Vale left the room without his laptop. That mattered. 1 hour earlier, he had controlled the data room, the summaries, the timing, and the confidence of the table. Now, Lydia Chen had suspended his access, Priya Desai had preserved the logs, Morgan Whitcomb Bank had paused financing, and Julian Price had agreed to remain as a witness. Martin still tried to look offended, but the room had already seen the hidden fee. $12 million. A success payment that only existed if Alexander signed. The advisor who mocked Naomi Brooks for being unqualified had been selling certainty from inside his own conflict. That was the first consequence, not an apology, a record. At 8:30 the next morning, Royce Capital issued an internal hold on the Silver Haven transaction. Every board member received the compliance packet. The packet included the restricted lease documents, the care complaint file, the data room upload log, the lender disclosure gap, the hidden broker fee, and the Brookline archive record showing Clara Brooks' letter had reached Alexander's office years earlier. Lydia named the file Silver Haven Pre-Signing Escalation, case number Royce 7841. The board did not like the title. Lydia did not change it. At 9:15, Martin Vale was placed on immediate leave pending termination. Vale Strategic Partners was referred to outside counsel. Morgan Whitcomb Bank required a new credit review. The Silver Haven seller was notified that signing was suspended because the buyer had discovered incomplete disclosures and internal conflict concerns. At 9:40, Alexander sat alone in his office with Clara Brooks' letter printed in front of him. He read the line again. Please send someone who will walk the halls before approving the next cut. The sentence was not complicated. That was what made it unbearable. A simple warning had reached his company. A simple warning had been summarized as emotional. A simple warning had been ignored because the woman who wrote it had no title that made powerful people afraid. Alexander had built a fortune by reading what others missed, but he had missed Clara Brooks because he had not thought her worth reading. That was the second consequence. Not public shame, recognition. Downstairs, Naomi did not know any of this yet. She was at home in Queens, sitting across from her mother at the small kitchen table. Clara wore her blue robe. Naomi still wore the black pants from her shift because she had been too tired to change. The lamp above the stove made the room look warmer than it felt. Naomi told her everything: the mockery, the lease clause, the complaint files, the hidden advisor fee, the archive, the letter. When Naomi said the letter had been found in Royce Capital System, Clara did not cry at first. She placed one hand over her chest and looked toward the window. They had it, she whispered. Naomi nodded. They had it. Clara closed her eyes. For 7 years, I wondered if I had sent it to the wrong place. Naomi reached across the table. You did not. Clara looked at her daughter. Did he hear it this time? Naomi thought of Alexander's face when the routing record appeared. I think he heard it. Clara gave a tired smile. Hearing is the smallest part. Naomi knew what came next. Doing. Clara nodded. Doing. At 10:30, Elena Hart gathered the staff of the Meridian Room in the service hallway. She did not hide behind a corporate memo. She stood where Naomi had stood, near the stainless steel carts in the coffee station, in front of servers, bussers, runners, cooks, dishwashers, and managers. Elena said, Last night I failed Naomi Brooks. The hallway went silent. I was afraid of losing a powerful guest, she continued. I let that fear slow my response when one of our employees was publicly humiliated. I cannot undo that. But I can make sure no one here has to depend on a guest conscience to be protected. She opened a printed policy. From today forward, any guest who insults, threatens, or degrades staff loses service privilege. Private dining minimums do not purchase the right to abuse people. Managers must intervene immediately. Incident reports will be preserved. Service station audio and security footage will be saved when staff report harassment. And the restaurant will create an education fund for employees who want certification, college credits, or career transition support. Talia Ramirez looked at Naomi. Naomi stood near the locker room door, arms folded. She was glad. But she also knew policies are only promises until someone powerful tests them. Elena looked directly at her. This came too late for last night. It must not come late for the next person. Naomi nodded once. That was not forgiveness. It was a beginning. 3 days later, Alexander requested a meeting with Naomi and Clara. Naomi almost refused. Clara did not push her either way. You do not owe him your pain twice, Clara said. Naomi looked at the folder on the kitchen table. Brookline records, hospital bills, the old employee badge, the letter, proof beside proof. I know, she said, but if rooms like his are finally opening, somebody should walk in before they repaint the truth. The meeting took place at Mercy South Medical Center, not Royce Tower. Naomi chose the location. Alexander arrived without cameras, without a public relations team, and without a photographer pretending to be an assistant. Lydia Chen came as compliance officer. Priya Desi came as legal witness. Julian Price came because Naomi trusted that he had not laughed when everyone else did. Clara sat beside Naomi in a wheelchair, wearing a gray sweater and the calm expression of a woman who had been underestimated too often to be impressed by a suit. Alexander stood when she entered. "Miss Brooks," he said. Clara looked at him. "Which one?" Alexander lowered his head. "Both." That was the first thing he said correctly. He placed a folder on the table. "This is not a request for forgiveness. This is documentation of what the board approved this morning." Naomi did not touch the folder. "Tell us." Alexander sat only after Clara nodded. Royce Capital is creating a Brookline Review Fund for former Brookline Senior Services employees affected by the acquisition transition. It will be administered by an independent trustee, not my office. It will review medical coverage gaps, severance errors, and hardship claims from that transition. Your family can apply through the same process as everyone else. No special headline, no photograph, no donor wall. Clara listened. Alexander continued. "We are reopening the Brookline post-acquisition file. Your letter will be included by name. The internal summary that dismissed it as emotional will also be included by name. The board has ordered a review of staffing reductions, benefit communications, and ignored complaints." Clara's hands tightened. By name. Yes. For years her warning had been buried as a complaint. Now it would become part of the official record. Alexander turned to Naomi. "Silver Haven remains suspended. If it proceeds, it will not proceed under Martin model. No resident displacement for luxury conversion. No reduction of essential care staff. Full disclosure of complaints and lease exposure. A human impact review before capital approval. A board-level healthcare investment committee chaired by Lydia with outside resident advocates and worker representatives." Naomi asked, "And what do you want from me?" Alexander did not dress it up. "I want to offer you a paid role as an independent analyst on the Silver Haven Review, because I saved you money." "Yes." The honesty surprised her, "and because you saw what my team chose not to respect," he said. Lydia added, "Written scope, access to original documents, right to dissent, no public relations obligation, no silence agreement covering misconduct." Naomi looked at Clara. Clara said, "Do not look at me like I raised you to be scared of rooms." Naomi almost smiled. Then she turned back to Alexander. "I have conditions." Alexander nodded. "First, my mother care is not a personal gift from you. If she receives help, it comes through the Brookline Review Fund under the same process as everyone else." "Agreed." "Second, I see original documents, not summaries." "Agreed." "Third, residents and care workers speak before approval, not after." "Agreed." "Fourth, if the ethical version of the deal makes less money, you do not quietly return to the cruel version when the room gets impatient." Alexander looked at Julian. Julian said, "I will make that difficult." Lydia said, "So will I." Alexander looked back at Naomi. "Agreed." Naomi leaned forward. "Fifth, stop calling harm a soft factor." Alexander was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Agreed." Clara studied him. "Do you understand why my daughter knows your world so well?" Alexander looked at her. "Because my world entered your kitchen." Clara nodded. "Good. Do not forget the address this time." 6 weeks later, Martin Vale was formally terminated. Outside counsel referred the undisclosed fee structure to regulators and civil authorities for review. 2 junior analysts admitted that Martin ordered the liability folder restricted before the dinner and told them Alexander did not want distractions before signing. One analyst said he knew it felt wrong but stayed quiet because Martin promoted people who made problems disappear. Lydia asked him, "And what did silence promote?" The analyst answered, "The problem." That sentence became part of the final report. The board did not escape untouched. The review found Royce Capital had rewarded speed over scrutiny and financial return over human consequence. Alexander signed the findings himself and released a public letter that did not name Naomi without her permission. "We mistook polished summaries for truth. We treated human consequences as secondary risk. We allowed status to outrank evidence. That changes now." Naomi read the letter at the kitchen table. Clara asked, "Do you believe him?" Naomi thought for a while. "I believe paper when action follows it." Clara smiled. "That is my girl." 3 months later, Naomi walked into Royce Capital for the first time as an independent analyst. She wore a simple dark blazer. She carried her own binder. Her shoes were repaired, not new. She had chosen that on purpose. The first report she presented was called Silver Haven Human Risk Analysis. No revenge, no decoration. Facts. Facility 7 had land lease exposure. Facility 14 had unresolved night staffing complaints. Facility 17 required staff retention before restructuring. Resident transition risk was high. Short-term profit would be lower under the revised plan. Long-term legal, reputational, and operational risk would be lower too. A board member named Richard Hale frowned at the last page. This reduces projected return by almost 30%. Naomi looked at him. Yes, that is a major reduction. So is losing the place where you know every hallway. The room went quiet. Months earlier, Alexander would have interrupted or translated her into softer language. Now he waited. Richard said, "Investors will ask why we left money on the table." Naomi replied, "Tell them the money was sitting on someone's grandmother bed." Julian Price covered his mouth to hide a smile. Lydia wrote the sentence down. The vote passed under revised terms. Silver Haven would not become luxury apartments. Essential care staff would be retained. Complaint clusters would be addressed before expansion. Resident families and worker representatives would report quarterly to the board. A portion of profits would fund training, wage stabilization, and facility repairs. It was not perfect. No deal becomes pure because one woman speaks the truth. But it was different. Different matters. 1 year later, Naomi returned to school, not as a charity case, not as a billionaire project, as Naomi Brooks, finance student, analyst, daughter, a woman who learned that intelligence does not vanish when life interrupts a degree. Clara Health stabilized. The Brookline Review Fund covered part of the insurance gap after an independent trustee confirmed the early transition had harmed dozens of former workers. Clara filed the approval letter beside her old employee badge. Proof beside proof. The Meridian Room Education Fund paid for Talia's first accounting certificate. Elena enforced the staff dignity policy twice in the first month, once against a celebrity investor who thought yelling at a busser was part of private dining service. Elena called Naomi afterward. "I did it faster this time." Naomi said, "Good." Elena asked, "Is that forgiveness?" Naomi answered, "It is progress." Progress was less dramatic than apology, but more useful. At the end of the year, Royce Capital hosted a scholarship dinner at the Meridian Room for service workers, displaced care workers, and adults returning to finance, health administration, accounting, and compliance. Naomi attended as the speaker. She stood in the same private room where Alexander had once mocked her. This time, the glass table was gone. Simple chairs faced a small podium. Talia sat in the front row. Clara sat beside Julian, wearing a navy dress and holding her Brookline badge inside her purse. Alexander introduced Naomi with one sentence. She was the first person in this room to ask the right question. Then he stepped away. No rescue speech, no ownership of her story. Naomi stepped to the podium. For a moment, she saw herself as she had been that night. Black uniform, water pitcher, cracked phone, worn shoes, a table laughing before it listened. Then she looked at the workers, students, and tired adults in front of her. "The most expensive mistake in any room," she said, "is assuming wisdom only sits at the head of the table." No one moved. She continued, "The truth does not become smaller because the person carrying it is tired. It does not become less precise because it comes from someone with sore feet. And it does not disappear because a room laughs before it listens." Clara wiped her eyes. Naomi smiled softly. Also, the footnote was terrible. The room laughed. This time, laughter did not wound. After the event, a young waitress approached Naomi near the service hallway. "Miss Brooks, can I ask for financial advice?" Naomi smiled. "Of course, I'm taking night classes," the girl said, "but sometimes I feel stupid walking into class after serving people who talk down to me all day." Naomi looked at her uniform, her tired eyes, the pen behind her ear. "Do not let anyone price your mind by the clothes you wear to survive." The girl swallowed. Naomi continued, "And keep proof, notes, records, emails, screenshots, not because you need permission to be smart, but because the world often respects paper before it respects people." The girl nodded. "I will." Later that night, Naomi returned home and opened her finance textbook at the kitchen table. Clara sat beside her with tea. The black notebook lay open to the first page. Under Clara old sentence, Naomi wrote a new one. "The people closest to the cost often see the risk first." Clara read it and nodded. Outside, Queen's traffic moved through the night. Inside, the lamp above the stove glowed over books, bills, medicine, and a future that had not become easy, but had become open again. So if this story made you think of someone whose intelligence was ignored because of their job, race, clothes, age, or bank account, write their name in the comments. If you have ever watched a powerful person laugh at someone who deserved to be heard, share this story. And if you believe dignity should not require a title, wealth should not excuse cruelty, and justice begins when one quiet voice refuses to disappear. Subscribe for more stories where the overlooked speak, the arrogant are forced to answer, and the truth finally gets a seat at the table. Alexander Royce asked a waitress for financial advice because he wanted to mock her. He expected embarrassment. He expected silence. Instead, Naomi Brooks read the footnote, exposed the hidden fee, found the human cost, and forced a $500 million empire to stop before it repeated the harm that had already entered her home. She did not understand money because she had the most of it. She understood money because she had seen where money was missing when people needed it most. In a hospital bill, in a medicine bottle, in a lost insurance plan, in a mother letter, no one answered. That night, the richest man at the table learned the poorest lesson of his life. A person can own towers and still miss the truth standing beside the water pitcher. And the woman holding that pitcher may be the only one brave enough to save him from drowning in his own numbers.